So I'm Julie Gale, and I know all of you here. Moved. Tammy, I hear some feedback.
Peggy's got it.
No? Oh, I see.
You can do
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So we, Peter, my husband Peter and I lived in Westchester County, raised our 4 kids there. But in 1988, we bought a second home here in Hillsdale. It's exactly 36 years right now. And 36 is a lucky number. So at any rate, when we had 3 sons and then a daughter, and when our youngest was about 10, we decided it was time to leave Westchester and move up here full time. And never looked back, really never looked back. We just loved being here from the beginning. I started out as a social worker. I got a master's in social work in community organization and really did not enjoy it. I wanted to be a chef, and my dad, who was paying for my education at the time, said, "I won't pay for culinary school, you'll just get fat." So you knew him, right? You could see that. And so I became a social worker instead. And then when our youngest went off to kindergarten, I decided that it was time to do what I loved. And so I started teaching cooking. And that was 23 years ago, something like that. And I've taught thousands of people, and including someone sitting right here. Hundreds of classes, and I loved almost every minute of it. I had Steph Chin, who some people here know, did a guest spot for me at the Mamaroneck High School adult education. And there was a woman in there who was completely, I would say, obstreperous. She just interrupted me every 10 seconds. And that was the only time in all these years that I was uncomfortable. But other than that, I loved teaching cooking. And then as my parents started to get older, I could see that their end was soon. I was looking at the recipes my mother had given me. She gave me her whole box of recipes when she stopped cooking. And they're little handwritten scraps of paper from my grandmothers and my great aunt and their friends. And I said, these little pieces of paper are going to just disintegrate if I don't do something with them. And so I thought of putting them in a cookbook. But then as I looked at the recipes, they all brought up stories about these people and the people who cooked them. And I said, it's time. I'm going to write a memoir. But that was 10 years ago. And it took 10 years and a lot of busy life in between. And then COVID happened. And I had the time to sit down. And my father had this phrase that said, a big job takes application of the tuchus to the chair. So that's what I did. I sat at my chair and finished the book. So unless you have any questions about what I said so far, I'll do a little reading. I come from a long line of storytellers. The dinner table has always been the stage for the stories of my life. My grandparents, parents, brother, and I have all delighted in telling and retelling the stories of our family. As we sit around the Thanksgiving or Passover table, the younger generation does not so much enjoy hearing one more time the story of how so-and-so did such and such. Yet, here it comes again, to my great delight. This book of memories was born at a time when my parents were old enough that I could see their end coming, and it was a way to preserve this piece of them for their grandchildren. Stories were not the only delicious things served at those tables. The food rivaled the stories and made them a bit more bearable. I also come from a long line of great cooks. I truly believe it is a gene that runs through our family and has not stopped with me. Our 4 children are wonderful cooks. And my dear husband, Peter, who was not brought up in a family who loved to cook, this has made him all the more the wonderful audience that he is. He enjoys the stories and the food that accompanies them so much and never tires of my efforts in both story and food. It is my hope that by writing this book, these memories of my family of unique characters and the recipes for the food we love to cook and eat will become a treasured addition to your family's heirloom recipes as well. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry. I believe that I am most comfortable in my skin when I am cooking. My earliest memories are in the kitchen or at the kitchen table. I began making my breakfast for myself starting at age 5. I could barely reach the counter, but I would get my cereal, bowl, spoon, and milk and sit down and eat. When I think back on this, I cannot imagine allowing such a small child to be alone in the morning before school. At the time, I was pretty proud of myself and didn't know that other children had it any other way. My dad was usually away all night delivering babies, and my mother was a late sleeper. I was responsible for getting myself dressed, fed, and out the door to the school bus. Pretty impressive, I must say. When I was 6, we moved to a big house in a wealthy neighborhood with a live-in housekeeper, and that was the end of my solo mornings and the beginning of what might be called my privileged upbringing. We raised our daughter along with our 3 sons in suburban Westchester County, New York, and spent our summers in the Hudson Valley. By the time Elizabeth, who was the youngest by 8 years, was finishing elementary school, we began to understand that we all needed to leave the entitled world of Larchmont and live a simpler, more rewarding life at our weekend home in rural Hillsdale, New York. Elizabeth spent the next 8 years in a magical Waldorf school, less than 10 minutes from home. Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School was not allowed, was integrated into the life of the Hawthorne Valley farm with cows, pigs, chickens, and farmland. I admit that I grew up in suburban Long Island in a fancy house in a fancy neighborhood with fancy furniture and fancy parents. However, living in a big empty house in Woodbury did not make me feel privileged. My parents always hired live-in help, which I understood at the time was indeed a privilege of sorts. These ladies were nice enough, but none were English speaking, so although there was always someone home when I got off the bus, they were completely unable to ask me how my day was or what I learned at school. These South American women came through the house as through a revolving door, rarely staying for more than 6 months and therefore never learning to speak English. I did, however, learn to speak kitchen Spanish, which, as it turned out, served me well my whole life. As I think about it now, I don't believe that I've ever had to cook for myself ever again. When I left college, I lived at home until I was married and have been cooking for my husband and my children ever since. I realize now that when I was a child, I had to cook to feed myself, but cooking literally fed my soul as well as my belly. This book traces the path of that child who in a sense cooked to live, and the path of the woman she became who lived to cook. These are the stories of my life and the recipes that fed my soul. So I'll read a little bit of chapter 1, and then if you have any questions, it's just us, so. Chapter 1, 244 Twin Lane East, Wantagh, New York, 1956 to 1962. When I was an infant, my parents bought a small post-war home in the Levitt-built community of Wantagh, Long Island. I remember it as sweet and compact with conveniences such as a carport adjacent to the snug kitchen. The kitchen window over the sink looked out into the carport. This gave my mother the view she needed when I was having a snack out there. Just inside the house from the carport was a small playroom. The little fenced-in backyard had a tree swing and easy access for my best friend, Kenny Milne, who lived next door. Kenny and I spent our days running in and out of our houses, playing in the sandbox with my pet turtle, Susan, and very naughtily picking the neighbors' tulips. One memorable incident involved our disobeying strict orders, and crossing the street to the neighborhood playground. We were both given a spanking for that escapade. My first and last, but probably not his. Kenny's mother could always be counted on for after-school snacks such as cheese doodles, devil dogs, and our beloved cherry Kool-Aid. We were not allowed such unwholesome treats at my home, so naturally I requested them every time we played at his house. However, we were only allowed to have the Kool-Aid outside at our little table under their carport, for those cherry red stains were forever. When I was about 5 years old, on an early spring morning, I looked out of my bedroom window and saw Kenny, dressed in a yellow bunny suit, delivering an Easter basket to my door. Easter was a foreign and forbidden holiday in our Jewish household, and that was the first and only time I have ever had an Easter bunny delivery. I remember how delighted I was to tear open the yellow and pink cellophane wrapper that enveloped foil-wrapped chocolate eggs and marshmallow bunny. Kenny was the perfect next-door neighbor, always available, yet close enough to go home when we weren't having fun anymore. There's something very special about having a best friend right next door. So, does anybody have any questions?
What happened to Kenny, do you know?
You know, my brother, who lives in Iowa, was reading the book and he called me and he said, I haven't thought about Kenny Milne in so long. I don't know.
We did go back though, the neighbor.
Yes, in the book, you'll see, we went back to, maybe I should read that. We went back to visit, the house. Let me see, I don't know where it is. And let's see, it was the most dilapidated house on the street. It was in Wantagh, and all the little houses which were built by Bill Levitt. It was, I think my parents paid $11,000, $12,000 for the house. And they were all kept beautifully, at one after another, perfect. And that little playground across the street was still there. And then we got to, what is it, 244 Twin Lane East, 244. And it was dilapidated. There were like, there was a sculpture of a dog peeing on a hydrant
Right.
in the front lawn. There were tuna cans, empty tuna cans, all I presume for a cat, like all over the lawn. And I took my courage up and I rang the bell, and this pot reeking young man answered the door, and it turned out that his grandfather bought the house from my father. Yeah. So he was so disheveled and it was such a mess that I just said,
You weren't invited in anyway.
I was not invited in. No, I was not invited in. I didn't ask to go in. But it's still a sweet, sweet neighborhood. Unfortunately, not my house. Yeah, so I don't know where Kenny Milne is. He had a lot, he was a rascal, you know, in that time of the Little Rascals, he fit right into that category. And let's see.
Do you have any memories at all about the women of food memories about the women who came into care of you?
I remember we
Because
had
they cooked for you.
somewhat, my mother was a
I
great
know your
cook.
mother cooked.
My mother was a great cook, my father was a great cook, and so they sort of didn't ask the women to cook too much. But we did have a woman from Trinidad one year, her name was Clarice, and she told us she had 4 sets of twins as kids.
Oh. wow.
I know, it's hard, I don't know, but she made amazing spicy fried chicken that I have tried to replicate and have not been able to do so. But the other ones, not so much. I think, you know, my mother was really a little protective of the kitchen. That was her territory. But it was a very informal dinner table at our house in some ways compared to my husband's family's dinner table. But my father would come home from delivering babies at who knows what time. And he expected that my mother would have dinner hot on the table as he walked in the door. Yeah, because he didn't eat all day and he was like a bear coming home. And I'm telling you, often he would look at this beautiful table of food that my mother had spent all afternoon making, and he'd go like this. And we knew what that meant. That meant get in the car, we're driving to Chinatown,
Oh, dear.
and leave that beautiful table full of food, and off we went. I remember one time, it was 3 times in 1 week, it was an hour to Chinatown and back. It was a school night. I was like, Dad, I have school tomorrow, I have homework to do, we've been to Chinatown twice already this week. Off we went.
Oh my goodness, because he didn't want, because
He didn't want the meal?
Didn't want the meal.
He didn't want the meal, no. How much of the book comprises recipes, and how would you characterize them? Traditional Jewish, gourmet of the time, or what? Very good question, thank you. So there are 110 recipes in the book. And I would say the earlier part of the book, which is about my grandparents and is more traditional Jewish recipes. But my parents, interestingly enough, did not cook Jewish food at all. They loved the Time Life series, Foods of the World. That was their Bible. And so we ate food from all over the world every night. And so starting, I would say by the 3rd chapter, it's really more recipes that I learned that were outside of the Jewish culture. My grandparents were the only ones who served matzo ball soup, or truthfully, I can't even remember traditional food at our Friday night table. My parents were so anti-religion that we would light the Shabbat candles, but over spare ribs. So literally over spare ribs. So yeah, not so much. And they also do represent, the recipes represent different eras, of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The last recipe in the book, I was teaching cooking at Olana in Hudson, which was lovely, except that they don't own any cooking equipment at all. I had to bring everything, including spoons. And so I had made, they were doing a celebration of Churchill, right? Church. And so it was in the 60s when he sort of his popularity rose. So I did a Jello with wine in it and little pieces of fruit, and it was a huge hit. And my kids all said, "Those are Jello shots, Ma." I was like, "Oh, I didn't know." So that's the range of recipes in the book. And I try to think of it as a memoir with recipes as opposed to a cookbook. I do have another book on the back burner, so to speak. It's going to be called 20 Years at the Kitchen Table. And it's the recipes that I taught at my cooking school, which is called At the Kitchen Table.
I'm assuming that for each of the moments in your life that you chronicle, there were more than one recipe that could have been chosen. How did you choose the ones that you feature in the book?
So the question was, because there must have been more than one recipe in a period of my life, how did I choose the ones that I put in the book? So that was something that I had to decide very much at the beginning of writing the book. So how was it going to be driven? Was it going to be recipe driven or story driven? So I looked through I made a list of all the recipes that I could think of growing up and that I enjoyed. And then the ones that had a story attached to it were the ones that I chose. Thank you for your question.
I mean, I have lots more.
Go for it, Rick. Go for it, Rick.
So
He's my plant.
I'm gonna get the address wrong, but I think your village apartment was 70 East 10th Street.
That's right.
Did I get it right?
You got it right.
All right. And it was an interesting story because you moved in and then had to move out because you weren't no one informed them you were
Yes.
moving in?
Yes,
And then you had to move back into
My
your
parents,
parents' house?
yes.
Can you do, that
Sure.
must have been a fraught.
So the question was, at the time when we were first married, we moved into an apartment in the East Village that we thought we owned. Which we didn't, and so we had to leave. And after literally, we were just married, moved into my husband's parents' home until we got accepted by the board. So we were, before we got married, we looked at apartments all over New York City and literally could not afford anything anywhere, anywhere. And then Peter's grandmother conveniently passed away. And so as a wedding gift, Peter's parents gave us her apartment which is on 10th Street in the East Village. And it was perfect. It was great. And so we came back from our honeymoon. Literally that morning, we took our 2 little suitcases, moved into the apartment we had nothing. And at 11 o'clock at night,
yeah, mattress on the floor.
we had a mattress on the floor. 11 o'clock at night, we got the doorbell rang and it was the superintendent
The
asking
handyman.
who we were. The handyman, right, asking who we were. And we explained that we owned this apartment. It was given to us as a wedding gift. And he was like, nope, the board has to approve you. You have to leave first thing tomorrow morning. So we packed our stuff, our 2 little suitcases, and we moved to Peter's parents. I was working on Long Island at an art gallery that I owned at the time, so commuting from Westchester to Long Island, and Peter was working in New Jersey, so commuting from Westchester to New Jersey every day. And we had different hours. I worked Tuesday through Sunday, he worked Monday through Friday. So we didn't see each other a lot. And then the board met and we were interviewed 3 months. It took them 3 months to wait. And they asked what the density level of the apartment was during our interview. And I was like, how many chairs can you put in? And then I realized that here we're this young couple and everyone in that building was minimum in their 70s, minimum. And they really didn't want us with the potential of babies, crying babies. But they did accept us, and we stayed until we had a baby. And when Adam was 4 months old, we took him to Shakespeare in the Park. And I laid out that blanket, we put our little baby down on the blanket and a rat went right past his face. And that was it. We moved to Larchmont. But living at his parents' house was challenging, mostly because it was a very formal home. They had a buzzer under the dining room table that you stepped on when you wanted the maid to come in with more food. And dinner was at 8 p.m. sharp every night. They had a cook who made every meal, decided what every meal was going to be. And so for 3 months I wasn't cooking, and it was really hard for me not to be cooking and eating someone else's. Yes.
Cooking at all.
Yes, and then when we had 2 young boys, we decided to do some renovation on our house and we moved back to their house. They were very nice to let us move in with 2 little boys, but dinner was still 8 o'clock every night. And whatever it was that Doris decided to make. And so we challenged ourselves yet again.
And I don't remember, do you remember what the recipe was for this time in the book?
Which time in the book?
For when you were moved back, when you had to move
Is
out
there
of
a
the town
recipe
street?
attached? I know, I don't remember when you.
Back to the
Peter's
city?
parents' house,
Oh, to
so
Peter's parents' house.
just this
Well,
part.
part of the book talks about my difficult relationship with my mother-in-law, and luckily there's not much of Peter's family around to hear it. His sister did call me and I warned her. I was like, you are in the book and it's not so great. The other sister, I don't know if she even knows about the book.
Well, she knows about the book, but I haven't heard about
I don't know. So the question was, do I remember the recipes from that time period? And so I was trying really hard to impress my mother-in-law. One time I was before we got married, I was living with my parents when we owned an art gallery on Long Island. And I made a soccer tort for my mother-in-law, well, soon to be mother-in-law, huge big chocolate cake with apricot filling. And we drove from Long Island up to Westchester. I had it on my lap so that it shouldn't shift in the car. And we're on the
Frogs like.
Throgs Neck Bridge, and he stopped short, and my arm went through the cake, literally through the cake up to my elbow. And so I spent the next maybe half an hour slowly extracting my arm from the cake and patching it up as best I could. So embarrassed to hand her this thing, but she was so excited to get this cake, she didn't even blink and took it up to her room, and that was the end of it. Ate the whole thing by herself in her room.
It's not shared.
It was not shared, and I did it again. I made her a tarte tatin one time, which is apples on the bottom with a lovely cake on top, and you flip it over, and again, up to the bedroom, off it went. We didn't get to taste it. The last one I ever made was a panettone. I never made another panettone because it's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a yeasted Italian coffee cake for Christmas, and with candied citrus in the middle of it. And it rose beautifully, and I turned it upside down to let it cool for an hour and a half. And I gave it to her, and off she went. And I said to myself, that's it. I'm done. No more, no more. But she was special in her own way.
People in the South would say, bless her heart.
So someone just said in the South, they would say, bless her heart. Yes, it's true. It's true. I mean, now as I'm older than she was, she died very young. I understand that she had a need that met. And I provided it for her. I didn't get that at the time, unfortunately.
Well, food can be a very driving force, and with regard to extra good behavior or extra bad behavior or whatever, and I liked your story. This is only related in that how food makes someone behave a certain way. Your story about cooking meat in the kosher kitchen just to spite your roommate who you didn't like very much.
Yeah, so an audience member is reminded of a story that's in the book. I was an exchange student at Tel Aviv University in 1977, and I had 7 roommates. It was like a suite. And because my apartment mate, my roommate was kosher, the whole kitchen had to be kosher. And so separating milk and meat would be a real problem because we'd have to have 2 sets of dishes, one for the meat, one for the milk, 2 sets of silverware. So it was decided we would have only dairy in the kitchen. And that for me, that theoretically, that was a great idea. But in reality, I mean, I like meat. And she and I did not get along so well, especially when her boyfriend came to stay over for 2 weeks in our little room. It was not so good. So one day I was at the butcher, and the butchers there are very different than here. I imagine still, like if you go to buy a barbecue chicken there, and you say you want half the chicken, here you get like half, right? Well, there it's the top half or the bottom half. Very different. And they had like lamb necks, slices of lamb neck on sale. And it's kind of an intimidating looking thing, which challenged me. I was like, ooh, I have to buy that. And I had just bought a Yemenite cookbook, and there was a recipe for a Yemenite lamb neck soup. So you saw that? Yeah. So I made the lamb neck soup, and when Denise walked in and smelled that soup, she wasn't very happy. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll read one more little bit and then we'll see where we are. Okay, this is about when we bought the house here in Hillsdale. We were very uncertain as to where we wanted to own a second home, but we knew that our family needed more nature, more privacy, and a place where we had some time to be together as a family without the distractions of work, friends, and obligations. When I was 8 months pregnant with Toby, Peter found an ad in the New York Times about a small home in upstate New York, built as a schoolhouse in the 1860s, filled with, air quotes, antiques on 3 acres. The house was in Hillsdale, Columbia County, which borders the northern Hudson Valley and the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts. We had visited my cousin Nina in the area before, and we loved the combination of nature and culture, with both skiing and Tanglewood so close by. It was only a 2-hour drive from Westchester and was offered at a price we could afford. Peter went up to see it, as I was not up for a 4-hour drive in one day, and he fell in love. He tried to put a deposit down on the house at that moment, but the realtor said that she would not let him do that until I saw it as well. It was late January with about 3 feet of snow covering the grounds and the thermometer stuck at a piercing 10 degrees. But we bundled up Adam and Zach and traveled up to Hillsdale. One look at the enormous screen porch was all that I needed to agree that it was a perfect second home for us. The next chapter is devoted to the country house, but we lived, sorry, hold on. Okay, at the end of January, we closed on the house and kept most of the antique furniture that it came with. The furniture was definitely old, but not necessarily antique, and we had neither the time nor the funds to buy all new furniture. It was fine for weekends and okay for the summer too. The purpose of this place was not the dread indoors, but the exquisite outdoors. Peter took the kids to nearby Catamount for skiing, which they, not I, all eagerly enjoyed. At the house, we went cross-country skiing, made snowmen, went sledding down the enormous hill across the street, skated in nearby ponds, and made maple taffy in the snow. When we were inside, we played games, watched movies, and really enjoyed our solitude, which was an impossibility in Larchmont. Although the house had 4 bedrooms, we slept only in the 2 that were downstairs, we in one and the 3 boys in the other. The upstairs was used for guests. It was very cozy, and we felt like we were roughing it in the woods. We often had weekend guests, which was a strain on the plumbing and the kitchen, but it offered some distraction from the intensity of the cabin experience. The kitchen was a very tight galley design that had a very small amount of counter space and orange formica on the counters. The only window in the area was over the washing machine, adjacent to the kitchen, which I could barely see out of. There was absolutely no aesthetic to the space, but it was functional, and that was all that was needed when you have 3 small boys. During the first summer we owned the house in the country, I decided that Adam would briefly go to the local day camp in Westchester, and then we would spend the rest of the summer in Hillsdale, being in nature and on our own. Peter left Monday morning to work in New Jersey at the family factory and returned Thursday evening. That left me with all the boys all week. Dinner was often whatever the little guys would eat. Chicken nuggets, spaghetti, hamburgers, etc. However, Adam ate everything I like to eat, so I would make something a little more interesting for the 2 of us to go along with the kiddie food. I have always loved gardening, and now with 3 acres of land, I was free to have as large a garden as I could manage. We often overloaded with zucchini, tomatoes, and beans. I don't think I owned a credit card in those days, so Peter would give me what he thought would be enough cash to last me till the Thursday, and I often ran out of cash by Wednesday. So dinner would be whatever was in the fridge or in the garden, and Adam and I ate an awful lot of zucchini that August. And then there's a zucchini frittata recipe. So does anyone have any other questions? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Tammy, is there something else I should be doing?
No, I mean, I got, she has books for sale.
I have books for sale
And
and
there's
there's latkes, which are in the book. And this is ginger shortbread. We had a friend in Larchmont who was from Australia, and she taught me to make these ginger shortbreads.
Yes.
So thank you so much, and thank you on Zoom.